When you cut Jack Mohr short 5 minutes, so so we got Brother Jack Mohr with us again.
This hour is going to change the tempo a little bit for the meeting, and this hour and my message tonight are going to be more of an informational rather than inspirational type, although I hope the message tonight will stir you up a little bit. This morning I want to give you some vital information that I think all Americans need to know. I have a very fine technical assistant that will be helping me this morning, and if we happen to have a little time, which I doubt we will, but if we have any time at the end of the period, we'll open it up for questions, and he'll act as my interpreter. In recent years, I've had some problems with my hearing. The doctor said I stood too close to those big guns for too many, thank you, Peter, stood too close to those big guns for too many years and ruined a nerve in my ear, and I can't get a hearing aid that does me any good. My wife claims that I do it on purpose, but it's not really true. But or else it is part of a plot to prepare the thinking of the American people to get them in a warlike mood. I don't know whether you've noticed the large number of war movies that have come out on both in the theater and also on the TV recently, movies like Red Dawn and Rambo and so on. But Red Dawn is going to be of special interest to us in this hour because it follows a scenario that was laid down in 1964 at the Christian Patriots Defense League Freedom Festival in Licking, Missouri. Some of you folks were there. And we had a panel at that time made up of Colonel Bob Arnold, who was an authentic hero from World War II, who wrote a book about his experiences called A Rock and a Fortress, and Pastor Earl Jones, who will be speaking to you next hour, who was a expert that worked with at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico for many years, and I was nothing more or less than a gravel-scratching infantry officer from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. But we discussed that day some of the things that could possibly happen within the next few years, and the scenario that we laid down there was what might occur in the future were based on accounts that we had received not only from the Mexican border, from people in that area, but also from Old Mexico itself, and the application of a good deal of common sense and logic. And the scenario that we laid down in 1984 was so close to that of Red Dawn that I must have got at least 20 telephone calls wanting to know whether the three of us were the ones that drew up the scenario for the movie. Well, we didn't do it, so don't blame us for that. But that scenario, or that seminar, was placed on a VCR tape, and Brother Paul Johnson has them available, and also an update that was made last year where Earl and myself and Pastor Sullivan put on a similar seminar in the Illinois conference. So you may want to get one of those because it has proven to be quite interesting to people. And these two films have been shown to literally thousands of people around the country with varying results. Paul showed them to a Legionnaire group, an American Legion group, and they were quite shocked, and the only thing they didn't like about it is they said, "Where is your documentation for it?" And a lady not very long ago called up from Florida and said she had seen it at a women's club meeting in the St. Petersburg area, and then had gone to Washington, D.C. a few weeks later and had been in a meeting where a high-ranking State Department official had confirmed many of the things that we had talked about in that field. Now, I've noticed something from personal observation, and that has been that probably one of the major obstacles that we have in getting truth across to the American people is that very, very few of our people want to accept anything that's derogatory about our government or about our country, and I guess that's natural. Whether our government is a Republican government or a Democrat government, we don't particularly like to hear bad things about it. And even though these governments for a number of years now have been guilty of acts of treason against the American people, most Americans become either very angry, or they want to change the subject, or they want to attack the fellow that's giving them the information. Some of them will admit that the information that we are giving, although it's very shocking, might be true and it might be reasonable by when you look at what's happening, but they refuse to accept it unless they know the source of the information. Now, here's something that you might as well know, that if you give out your source of information, that source of information dries up almost immediately. Any thinking person can understand why, because the people that give this information put themselves in jeopardy not only from the government, but also from the enemies of the country. And so as a result, much of the critical information that we just got to say, well, I can't tell you where we got it from. And people have a tendency to kind of nod their heads, and they may not say it out loud, but they're saying in their own mind, that's what I thought, he's making all that stuff up. And I guess I experienced that reluctance a few years ago when I used to work for the John Birch Society. And in fact, earlier than that, in 1951, when I came back from Korea, I was sent out by the Army Public Relations Office in Fort Ord, California, to tell the people about what was going on in Korea. And I had some 90 or 100 speaking engagements in California and along the Pacific coast. And the general laid down one thing to me. He said, you go out and tell the American people the truth, just make sure you can back up what you're talking about. And so when I'd go and talk about an incident like I talked about last night, where I saw in Korea 3,800 people slaughtered in a 10-day period of time, and talked about some of the terrible ways in which they were eliminated and tortured to death, many people would kind of shake their heads and say, well, you're a pretty nice guy, but we don't believe you because human beings just wouldn't act that way, you see. And there was a few occasions when they even said, well, if what you said is true, take off your clothes and show us your scars. I had actually had people that asked me to do that. And then when I began speaking with the John Birch Society in 1968 to 1978, the question or the answer and the cry was always, where is your documentation, you see? I guess American people are just like anybody else. They don't like to be taken in by a con artist. You know, we hate to admit that somebody has pulled the wool over our eyes or fooled us. I don't know how many of you can remember back to the days of the old county fair when they used to have sideshows. And I remember my grandfather telling about a sideshow that was held in the tent, and a big sign outside of the sideshow that said, come in and see the horse with his head where his tail ought to be. And they would pay $1 and go in, and here would be a normal, ordinary horse tied by his tail to the manger. And, you know, they'd go out and they wouldn't tell anybody that they got taken in because they didn't want anybody to know how stupid they were, so that guy would just get money day after day after day. And then Grandpa used to tell about another guy that went around. You remember how they'd have these little tables and they'd have that pea game, you know, with a walnut shell, and you guessed which walnut shell was under? Well, they also had another one. This fellow set up a little stand, and he was selling aspirin tablets for $5 a piece. And there was a sign that said, these are smart pills. They'll make you smart. And an old colored gentleman, after he tried one of them, he came back and he said, hey, fella, that thing tastes to me like aspirin. And the guy that was running it said, see, you're getting smart already. Well, see, this is the sort of thing that happens, but we don't like to admit when we've been taken in. And so when I begin to talk about communist infiltration in the government of the United States and how there were actually men in Washington doing things that if they did it 100 years ago, we'd have taken them to court, we would have tried them, we would have convicted them, we'd have taken them out and either shot them or hung them. Oh, they got mad about it. They said, that guy must be a Nazi, he must be a fascist, at least he's crazy at the very least, and he's always anti-Semitic, always anti-Semitic. Although back in those days I didn't know much about the Jews, and I never talked about the Jews. And then when I began to learn a little bit about the Zionist involvement in communism, then of course all hell broke loose, you see. But along with this studying, a few years ago, we began to realize that there was something big happening south of the border in the border area between Mexico and the United States, and that a lot of people in the United States didn't know anything about it because our news media wasn't telling anything about it. There are many men, we began to realize that there were many Soviet troops in this area. Now, I'm going to show you in a little while where those troops are located and how we found out about this. What we began to realize that there were perhaps between 45,000 and 60,000 Mongolian troops down in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. A little bit later, about a year and a half ago, we realized that there might be anywhere between 30 and 45,000 North Korean troops in the Baja area of California. You know, that's that long peninsula that comes down out of California into the Pacific Ocean. We also found out that there was a large number, more than 25,000 Red Chinese troops in British Columbia, just north of the American border. You didn't read about that in your newspapers, did you? You didn't see anything about that on television. I even had one man say to me, don't you think that our government knows about what's going on, and that if those troops were down there, they'd do something about it? I want to tell you, my friend, I believe they know, and that's what scares hell out of me, and I'm not using that as a cuss word when I say that. I believe that our government knows what's going on. And I want to tell you, my friend, you say, well, that's a serious charge, brother, because you're accusing our government, or at least people in our government, of being traitors. That's exactly what they are. According to the definition that's given in the Constitution of the United States, Article 3, Section 3, where in terms that any fifth grader can understand, it said treason shall consist only in levying war against them, the United States, adhering to her enemy, giving them aid or comfort. And if keeping the American people from knowing the truth about what's happening isn't giving aid and comfort to the enemy, then I don't know the meaning of the English language. And our own government, folks, has allowed this to happen. We'll explain a little bit more as we go along, so that we're in very, very bad shape along the Mexican border. If you don't believe that, you ask some of the people that are concerned that live close to the Mexican border about what's happening down there. Now, I first heard about this Soviet buildup in Mexico, I guess about 3 years ago. I had suspected it from some other reports that I had received before that, but I actually wasn't sure of it until about 3 years ago. The reason that I suspected it was that as far back as 1974, there were some very substantial rumors out that Henry Kissinger and his pals in the Trilateralist and the Council on Foreign Relations were actually preparing Mexico to be used as a launching pad for a Soviet attack against the United States. Now, that's a serious charge against a man that was in government at that time as the Secretary of State, isn't it? But this is exactly what was happening at that time. And I could believe that these men were doing it after what I saw, what Henry did in the Panama Canal, and after what I saw how many of our congressmen voting exactly opposite to what their constituents wanted sold us out in the Panama Canal. I believed that they would also do this in Mexico. And then in June of 1979, there was a very interesting ad that appeared in Fortune magazine. Listen to what it said. Intelligence report of what the Soviets are doing in Mexico. It will blow your mind. True, documented, already submitted to the United States military, $10. You know what went through my mind immediately? Aha, another smart way to get a buck out of the American people. That's all they're trying to do, is to make money. And then in 1982, I received a verbal report from one of our Christian Patriots Defense members who live near the Mexican border. Now, I'm going to ask, if you will, please, to dim those lights. And Earl, would you put on that Mexican map and show me the Brownsville area, if you could, and that area around Lake Guerrero. Unfortunately, we can't get as much on as we would like to here. I hope that you'll be able to see this. But this is the Mexican map of the area south of Brownsville, Texas. Now, Brownsville is located right in here. Laredo is in here. San Antonio about up in here. And this man went down to Lake Gutierrez. I don't know how many of you fellows are bass fishermen, but you probably have heard about this fabulous bass fishing lake in Mexico, about 170 miles south of the border. It's located right about in this area here. And it's about 40 or 50 miles due east of the city of Ciudad Victoria, which is right there, which is the capital city of this area. It's a city of about 150,000 population. And they went down to this area. There were 3 of them that went down on a fishing expedition. They got down to the lake, and the weather was so bad, it was so windy that they couldn't get out on the lake. It's a big lake. And so the Mexican guide took them on a dove hunting expedition, which is in this area, right due east of Ciudad Victoria. They came over early in the morning, over a hill. They heard some motor activity, the sound of engines on the opposite side of the hill, and in curiosity they went to see what was going on. And as they came over the brow of the hill, they saw a large plane with many, many armored vehicles of various kinds. There were tanks, personnel carriers, jeeps, trucks, and so on. And on many, many of these vehicles there was the Red Star, the Russian Red Star, and they were very shocked by this. They actually took some pictures of it, brought it back to the United States, and then about a week later, in order to confirm that, they got permission from the Mexican government to fly in a small plane down to Ciudad Victoria. They detoured a little bit out of their way. They flew over this area right east of Ciudad Victoria. Their plane was shot down by a MiG fighter plane with no identification on it. They didn't know whether it was Mexican or Russian or what, but the pilot, or one of the men in the plane, was a World War II pilot. He knew what a MiG looked like. He said it was a MiG plane that shot him down. The pilot was killed. The passenger in the plane was thrown into a Mexican jail. He's been there now for 2 years. The governor of the state of Texas said he was nothing but a damn smuggler. I won't do anything to help him. And the American State Department has failed to do anything to help him. During this same period of time, there were at least 4 planes that I know of, transport planes, that were owned by a commercial firm in San Antonio, which is right about up in this area here, that were flying electronic equipment down into Mexico under special permission from the Mexican government. They were shot down by military planes in this area, and you didn't see anything about that in your newspapers or on television, did you? It came out in the Brownsville newspaper and one article in the San Diego newspaper, nothing else in any of the other areas of the United States that talked about that. Then about this same time, we got another report from a man who lives at a place called Del Rio. Now, Del Rio is located, if we had a big map, you remember how this, yeah, thanks, Earl, how this map, the Texas comes down around like this, and it goes up here, then there's a big bulge that comes down into Mexico. That big bulge follows the, yeah, here it is right here, follows the Rio Grande River, and is known as the Big Bend area, yeah, of Texas. Del Rio sets right up in here. Now, this fella here makes his living by taking out deer hunting parties in the fall of the year. He is he's part Indian. He speaks, I think, 6 Indian dialects. He speaks Spanish like a native. He's a rather dark-complected man, and most of the people think of him as a native. For many years, he has used Mexican nationals, that is, by that I'm talking about American citizens of Mexican descent, as guides for his game hunting part. In 1984, in November of last year, he could not find any Mexicans because, as he put it, all the good Mexicans have moved inland. They know something is going to happen along the border. They don't want to be there. He said, I couldn't get my regular people. So he said, I went down into old Mexico. He came across here at this border crossing place, came down into here with a truck, was able to load up on all the Mexican young men that he needed, bring them back across the border, and the American border guards didn't even stop him. Now, he said the interesting thing happened in the hunting camps. He said at nighttime, after the gringo hunters had gone to sleep, the guides would sit around the campfire and they would discuss things that were happening in old Mexico. And he said invariably the conversation would come around to the fact that every one of those young men had been approached by a foreigner. They didn't know who he was. He didn't speak Spanish. He was a white man, they thought. They thought that he was probably a Russian. They had all been offered large sums of American money, up to $1,000, which is a lot of money for a Mexican peon. And the idea was they were trying to recruit Mexican young men to join an expeditionary force that was going up along the Mississippi River that would be concentrated between New Orleans and St. Louis and then on up the Illinois River, I believe it is, to Chicago. The main job of these men would be, when the balloon goes up, to blow the bridges across the Mississippi River. They already have the equipment and the necessary cachet along the Mississippi River. They estimate there are 3 million of these illegals in that area now. Now think about it a minute. What would happen if the bridges across the Mississippi were blown? Where do your food products for the East Coast come from? They come through Omaha, almost all of them. Then they cross the river bridges either at St. Louis or down farther south at Cairo, Illinois. Those are the two main places where they cross the Mississippi River. And if the food products from the west would be cut off, the east would be having food riots in 2 weeks, because most of the big cities out there only have a 3-day food supply on hand. And you would see rioting going on in the big cities out there. The job of these young men was also to spread out from along the side of the river and to cause all the hell that they could in the towns along the river. And then at the same time, from the mouth of the Mississippi River, where there is the largest concentration of Vietnamese in the country. And it was very interesting to me that last year the leaders of the Vietnamese said publicly that they believed that possibly as much as 50% of the Vietnamese population in the United States were Viet Cong. In other words, the refugees, half of the refugees that came over were Viet Cong agents that were sent here for a specific purpose. Some of you remember in the news last year that there was some trouble with a Vietnamese fishing group at a place called Seadrift, Texas. This was north of Corpus Christi, about 100 miles on the Gulf Coast. You remember the Ku Klux Klan went in there and they had all sorts of trouble in that area. Well, there is a fellow in there by the name of General LUN. He goes by the title of General LUN. He's a Vietnamese. Last year he claimed to have 2 fully armed divisions of Viet Cong in that area. That means between around 20,000 or 25,000 armed Viet Cong ready to go if this thing ever breaks. Now, down in the Mississippi Delta area, south of New Orleans, is the largest concentration of Vietnamese in the country. They have been given, most of them are fishermen. Many of them have been given high-speed boats by the American government. And there's a great deal of ill feeling in that area because the American government has given them boats better than what the American fishermen can afford. These are high-speed diesel boats, twin diesel engines, with speeds up to 50 knots. Now that's fast for a 70-foot boat to travel 50 knots. That's mighty fast. That's better than 50 miles an hour. Many of them are river patrol boats that were brought over from Vietnam. And these boats, supposedly fishing boats, could cross the Gulf of Mexico to the Yucatan Peninsula in 4 hours and load up with all the way up to 70 men in each one and be back within an 8-hour period of time. Now, the Yucatan Peninsula is right down in this area, right in here. See, right in here. Here's Yucatan right here. 60 to 70,000 Mongolians been there for 3 years, and there's about a 4-hour trip by fast-speed boat to the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is right about up here where the end of my pointer is. So, and they could bring those fellows from there, and it's very interesting that one of the large Soviet arm dumps is right in the location of the star that you see here. I think we could probably turn those lights on for just a minute, Paul, if you want to. Well, there was an interesting thing. You know, I don't know how many of you fellows ever played football or not, but if you've ever played football, most people do what they call Monday morning quarterbacking. That is, you know, you have a football game on Saturday, your team loses, and on Monday morning you sit around discussing why your team lost, and somebody will say, well, if the quarterback would have passed that play instead of running, we'd have got a touchdown and we'd have won, and so on. You look back and see the mistakes you made. And so when I got this information, I remembered back to a rather interesting incident that had happened in 1974 when I was in the speaking tour for the John Birch Society in McAllen, Texas. That's down near Brownsville that we showed you down on that map a minute ago. And we were sitting in a cafe with a couple other fellows, and we were discussing the situation along the Mexican border. Now remember that this was almost about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, and my voice is pretty loud and it carries pretty well, and we noticed that 2 gentlemen sitting in the booth behind us were very interested in what we were saying. So I raised my voice just a little bit louder to make sure that they heard everything that I said. And as I was leaving, we sat there for maybe 30 minutes, and as I was leaving, One of the men stopped me and said, "Sir, we have overheard your conversation, and I would like to tell you something that might be of interest to you." He said, "I am a Baptist missionary. I have been down in central Mexico, south of Guadalajara, for about 8 years. And he said, we have known about this plan of invasion of the United States for 8 years. Oh, I said, that's interesting. What is the plan? He said, well, the way the Mexicans tell us, there is a plan underway by Mexican radicals, these are communist Marxist-type radicals, to take over a strip of the United States, beginning with Corpus Christi on the Gulf Coast, going over to San Antonio, from San Antonio over to El Paso, which is right on the Mexican border, then over to Tucson, and from there over to Los Angeles." He said, well, what's going to be the reaction of the American government? He said they evaluate that the American government will not go to war over that strip of land, that rather than to cause an international incident, they'll back away and let Mexico take it. And I said, what's going to be the carry-on from there? He said, then we'll take another little strip of land a little bit farther up, and before we get done, we'll have all of the southwest of the United States, and the American government will not take military action to stop us. And then about that same time, I ran across another very interesting incident. This was in 1978, I believe it was. No, this was a little bit later than that. It was in 1984. I picked this up out of a Montreal Canadian newspaper. The ambassador, the Mexican ambassador from Mexico to Canada, at an official function, he got tanked up a little bit, had a few drinks too many. He got up and he proposed a toast. Listen to this now. He proposed a toast to the mutual boundary between Canada and Mexico in 1986. Now you figure that out for yourself, where that mutual boundary is going to be. What does it mean? It means somewhere along the line there's a plan for the takeover of the southwest United States and the Pacific coast all the way up to the Canadian border, to be made a Spanish-speaking group. Then, later on in the year, this same man said that one night in the camp, a federale officer, a bird colonel, came into the camp. The federale, of course, is the Mexican National Army people. He came into the camp, and after having a few drinks, he boastfully said, we will be in Los Angeles before the end of 1986, and we are going to take over all the southwest part of the United States. And then we came across a very interesting thing, that there was a plan underway to actually force the 3 northern states of Mexico. I believe that's Chihuahua and Coahuila and Sonora, isn't it? The 3 of them that border on the United States, to actually put so much pressure against them, not only politically but economically, that they are going to ask the United States to help them. And that Mexico, along with the Soviet Union, will use this as an excuse, saying the United States is trying to take over the northern part of Mexico because of all the oil wells and all the mineral deposits, and therefore we are resisting an invasion by the imperialists from the north. And all over the world, the newspapers will spread out, America is attacking Mexico, and that'll be used as an excuse for an invasion of the United States. You put those together and think about that. And then a few months ago, another interesting thing happened. We weren't exactly sure about the North Koreans in the Baja, California, although we'd received many reports for it. A very good friend of Earl Jones had a Mexican foreman who went on a trip to the Baja to visit his family, came back with a confirmation that he had actually seen those troops there, and that not only that, but that they were bragging in the local pubs that they were going to be in San Diego before the end of 1986. You might want to talk to Earl about that. You might want to also talk to him a little bit about what we are attempting to do to inform the legislature of New Mexico. Actually, Earl has been able to work around to where we are going to have a meeting with the legislature of New Mexico sometime the first of the year. And also, I think, members from the National Security Council, I believe, that will be involved in that sort of thing. And yet, in spite of all this, we still have trouble and say, show me your documentation. Well, we've got the documentation now, folks. If you're willing to shell out a few bucks, you can get this documentation. The man has this available, has been working on it since 1974, and he has sent it to the American military, Oh, by the way, you might be interested in knowing this, that when we received the initial information of the arms dump and the Soviet equipment south of Brownsville, Texas, we gave that information to Washington, D.C. The American military, the Pentagon, didn't say very much about it. We couldn't get very much reaction about it. But the State Department officials said, this is none of your business. Keep out of that area. And if you say anything to the American people about it, you're going to be in trouble. And so when we began to talk about this, we began to get in trouble, just like they had promised. They used all sorts of nasty tricks against us. There's one man in prison down on the Mexican border right now, and a Mexican citizen, because of the fact that he talked too much about that. But this man now has available for $16. His name is Gregory Thatcher. If you want to put this down, if you're interested. Gregory Thatcher, T-H-A-T-C-H-E-R, and his address is 9501 Gramis, G-R-A-M-I-S Street, Houston, Texas. 9501 Gramis Street, Houston, Texas, zip code 77075. And if you write him, ask him for the Red Dawn Intelligence Report. Now, some of the information that I'm going to show you this morning was taken from that report. I have his permission to use that. Now, in May of 1976, in the Houston Post, there was an article that appeared written by a black activist by the name of Carl Rowan. Many of you have read his articles in the newspaper. This was the headline: Rightists breathe fire, Mexican menace stirs a tempest. He went on to mention that there were 30 members of the House of Representatives, led by Congressman Larry McDonald, Democrat of Georgia, who had warned then-President Ford that President Echeverria of Mexico was a communist sympathizer who was prepared to hand Mexico over to the communists. And Rowan tried to discredit McDonald because he was a big shot in the John Birch Society. But here are some of the other people that were along with him. John Ashbrook, Republican of Ohio; Joe Wagner, Jr., Democrat of Louisiana; Trent Lott, Republican of Mississippi, he's my congressman; Philip Crane, Republican of Illinois; and Steve Sims, Republican of Idaho. Immediately, Senator Mike Mansfield, who was the Senate Majority Leader at that time, said, it's ridiculous to even suggest that Mexico will ever go into the Mexican camp. These men are doing nothing but ruin our relations with Mexico. So Representative McDonald and Representative Sims immediately pointed out that Mansfield had a miserable track record as far as Vietnam was concerned, that he had been pro-communist from the very beginning, and that sort of shut him up. And so Mr. Rowan went to Representative Sims. He said, where did you get your information? And Sims snapped back at him, I got it from the Idaho farmers who are now living in Mexico and who detest the growing atmosphere of the police state, and that shut Mr. Rowan up. Now, about 6 years later, in 1982, 36 members of the House of Representatives warned President Reagan of the same thing. And as far as I've been able to find out, there was only one tiny item that came out in the newspapers anywhere, and that was in the Houston Post that was telling about it. Absolutely nothing on television. In August 1983, Representative McDonald made a statement before a House committee, and I got this information directly from Kathy McDonald, Representative McDonald's wife, that he had made the statement that he knew of at least 5 congressmen very high up in the Congress who were guilty of treason against the United States, and that when he returned from his official visit to South Korea, he was going to blow the whistle on him. He was dead less than a month later when the Soviets shot down the Korean Flight 007 on which he was bound for Seoul. This was a great deal of a shock to me because I knew Larry McDonald as a personal friend, and not only that, but because my wife and I had tickets on that same flight. We were bound to go over there as guests of the South Korean government because I was the first American that had been decorated in the Korean fighting. They had invited me over as their guest, and for some reason that I can't explain, and I'm sure most of you in your own mind can understand why, we canceled our flight 10 days before the plane took off. Now ask yourself one simple question. Why was it that the American CIA took Richard Nixon off the same flight that was headed for Seoul when it stopped in Anchorage and didn't take anybody else off. Just think about that for a little bit, and it might start your thinking processes and going as to why that flight was shot down. Not accusing anybody, just use a little common sense. Isn't it sort of strange that McDonald died after making a statement like that? Isn't it sort of strange that John Ashbrook died under mysterious circumstances about the same time? Isn't it sort of strange that a liberal Washington senator by the name of Scoop Jackson, who knew what was happening in Mexico, who had talked out very sharply about it, and he had delivered a stinging rebuke against the Soviets for shooting down the plane 007, and within 5 hours later he was dead of a heart attack, and he had never before had any symptoms of a heart attack? Don't those things seem sort of strange to you? Do you think they all happened by accident? I want to tell you, my friends, that over the last few years there is a Pearl Harbor building up south of the border, right in our own backyard. And very, very few people in the American government, including the President of the United States, have had the guts to tell the American people about it, because somewhere in the background somebody is saying they must not know. And I wonder if maybe the attempted assassination of Mr. Reagan when his first term, shortly after he had been in, wasn't exactly that, a warning, you either go by our rules and play ball, or this is what's going to happen to you. The more I see of it, the more I'm convinced that that's what it was. Now, Mr. Thatcher wrote a 21-page intelligence report in 1976 that was titled, "We Are the Enemy." And the interesting thing is that at this same time, the Mexican government began to build 1,100 runways in the northern part of Mexico. Think of that. 1,100 dirt runways that were capable of handling bombing planes. They weren't manned at that time, but a short period of time later, the Mexican government came out and said, we are starting an attack against the drug people in Mexico, and we're going to place one of our agents at each one of those 1,100 dirt runways. Do you suppose they might have had the equipment necessary to signal incoming Soviet planes that might be planned to land on those fields in the near future? I don't know. The Mexican government said, we built these to meet the fast-growing industrial and tourist need of that area. You know where the money came from? $25 million approved by the World Bank out of the American taxpayers' money to build those 1,100 runways in northern net. Now, Earl, if you put that map back on again, down in the in this area right here, here are some of the major supply points for the military. These are the big petroleum places that'll be used. One of them is Minitotlan, that's located up in here. The other one is Villa Hermosa, which is down in this area. Another one that's in the state of Tabasco. Another one is Tuxtla Gutierrez, which is right down in here. Another one is Tapachula, which is up in here. And then this other one that is down here, and I forget the name of that one. I think that's, Tapachula is down in this area here. Those are all major petroleum bases. You can put that back on again if you want to, Paul, for just a minute. It's interesting to note that at this same time, the Soviet Union was given a mosaic map of the Rio Grande Valley. What do we mean by a mosaic map? A mosaic map is a map that shows you the actual contour of the ground. Shows you where the hills are, shows you where the rivers are. It shows every river crossing on the Rio Grande. That was given to the Soviets by the International Commission of Boundaries and Water Commission. At the same time, the bridge in Laredo was widened from 4 lanes to 6 lanes, and it's interesting that that bridge and the bridge at El Paso were strengthened so that at the present time they can carry the heavy Soviet 60-ton tanks can go across them. Now you make up your own mind whether there was anything obvious in that or not. I don't know. Then it's very interesting, and Earl, if we could have that West Coast area put back on again, please. The Mexican government began to prepare for this by sending in a group of very radical Marxist peasants into this area north of Culiacan. Culiacan is the state capital in this area right here, and 195,000 acres in this area and this area were taken over by these peasants. About that same time, and I believe that if I want to get this straight now, yes, it was on the evening of December the 3rd, 1976, a very large convoy, or December the 3rd, 1976, a very large convoy of Soviet ships loaded with all sorts of military equipment came from the Pacific Ocean around the Baja California area, and they landed here and they landed here, where this land had been taken over. Now here is a very interesting thing. Immediately when they landed, there were flat cars waiting on the railroad siding to take them into areas where they could be sent up near the Mexican border. Now look how the railroad system loads. They loaded from here and went from here over to Treason, where Treason, there is a rail system that runs here and runs up to the Mexican border here at Eagle Pass. It runs up at Del Rio here, and it runs over here to Laredo, and it runs over to the Brownsville area. Also from Treason, there is another one that comes up here to right south of Douglas, Arizona, and another one that comes up here to El Paso area. There is another rail line that runs up here and branches out this way, and then also up to the El Paso area. Then along Highway 15, which is the major Pacific Coast Highway that runs up along here up towards California, there is a railroad that runs from this area and this area. It comes up to here. Bring that down, if you will, Earl, just a little bit. Thank you. It runs from there. It runs over to Douglas, Utah. Then there's another one that comes up to Nogales, right south of, well, it goes from a key point known as Benjamin Hill, which is right in this area. It goes on up to Douglas, Utah, and then it goes over on a branch of the Sonora Railroad up over here to Nogales, or to Mexicali and Tijuana, right south of San Diego. And these stars that you see are major underground concentrations of Soviet equipment. Here, 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 and you remember we saw the other one over there. Now, it's very interesting to note that about 6 or 7 months ago, we knew that there was a heavy concentration of heavy Soviet armor in this area south of El Paso. They were supposedly on maneuvers within 50 miles of the Mexican border. On one occasion, they made a sortie, evidently a reconnaissance, 150 miles inland into this area without encountering any American troops or any American opposition of any kind at all. Almost overnight, all of those tanks disappeared. We couldn't understand what happened to them. But here is a very interesting thing. You remember a few years ago when the big development took place in Mexico and all the oil drilling went on. It has since been found out that much of that was not oil drilling at all. But here are some of the points and some of the major crossing points, these little round dots here that we see. But something very interesting happened in that many of these oil wells were nothing more or less than an operation to pump out salt domes. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with salt domes or not. There's a very large one in the state of New York State that covers 5,000 acres underground, if you can imagine that. The men that are working in there have to get in an elevator. They go down 10,062 feet, and then they take a Jeep, and it takes them 30 minutes to go from the elevator out to the edge where they're working. You can imagine the size of that. Well, here in these areas where these stars are located are all underground salt domes. They have a roof that's about 20 foot high. They're held up by rock pillars, natural rock pillars, and then huge spaces that have been excavated around them, pumped out of water. They are absolutely dry. They remain at a constant 68-degree temperature, summer and winter, no matter what the outside temperature is, and they are now being used for storage areas in that area. Now, I want to show you some of the equipment that was brought in at this time by this convoy. Earl, if you would show us that. We're not going to have time to go into this too much in detail, but I think you might find it interesting, some of the type of stuff that is coming in. Now, they are bringing in heavy bombers. This is one of the latest bombers that they have. It is a turboprop bomber. In other words, it's not a jet plane, but this plane is capable of traveling 3,500 miles without refueling and can carry 160 paratroopers with their equipment. Earl, if you drop that a little bit, here is some of the armored equipment that they are being brought in. Now, this is being brought in two different ways. They're coming in by ships. They were loaded on these flat cars. They were immediately camouflaged so that people couldn't see it. And it was quite interesting at this same time that an order came out saying any American tourist coming south of the border cannot bring a CB into Mexico. You suppose it might be that they were afraid that they would report back something that they saw? I remember that this to be true because my wife and I were going down to a little town called San Blas in Nayarit, which is way down here on the Pacific coast. We were going down there for a vacation, and we had to take our CB out of the car before we could cross the border. This was a few years ago. And they were bringing these in also by submarines. And we'll show you a little bit more about that. Some of these are personnel carriers, armored personnel carriers. These are armored scout cars and the type of tanks. These things here have an 85 millimeter high velocity gun on them, which is about comparable to our 90 millimeter gun. Earl, would you show us that next one, please? It's quite interesting, too, that while this was going on, special sidings were built, sidecar railroad areas along the railroad around the major cities, so that when these trains going up with military equipment, if they met a passenger train, they could pull off on a track on one side where nobody would notice them and they wouldn't be in the way. Here are some of the tanks that are a picture of the tanks being used with support by infantry support by air. And here are the type of planes that are used. This is a little bit smaller plane. This is also a turbojet plane that carries maybe 80 or 90 fully armed men and will go up to 1,500 or 2,000 miles without being refueled. Let me see that other one too, please. No, the next slide, please. Yeah, we don't want that Russian standing on his head. Now, this is a armored personnel carrier that is dropped by parachute. It's carried in one of these planes that we've seen. Also, this equipment can be carried by plane. Here is a rocket launcher that can carry a nuclear warhead with a 1,500 mile range. In other words, from northern Mexico, where these dumps are, they can reach pretty much all the major western and central cities and the cities along the Gulf Coast. This tank here is an anti-tank gun. A 56 millimeter. It fires something like 120 rounds a minute. It's got two barrels. They go out like this as they fire in a recoil. And then this is a shoulder-held rocket launcher that is used by the infantry for firing against low-flying planes. It's called the SA-7. Fires like a rocket launcher from the shoulder. It actually is a infrared heat-seeking weapon that follows the plane so that it can't outmaneuver it, and it's very, very effective. It has been used to some extent in Afghanistan, although those people over there haven't got very many of them. Okay, Earl, the next slide, please. Upside down again. Now, here again, these were the major areas that they went out to by rail. I think we covered that enough. Let's have the next one, please.
You want the
Yeah, go ahead. Next slide.
next slide? You want that train?
No, next slide. Now, all of these little squares, all of these little round places here that you see are all underground salt domes, which are used for storage areas. You notice that they're predominantly up towards the American border. Okay, the next one, please. This is some of the other equipment. I think we better let's skip over that equipment, Earl, and get to that next one that we have. And I think the next one is a map, I believe, that we've...
One after next, okay.
Yeah, not that map. No, not that one. The one following it, yeah. Just put that one beside. We won't use that one. Now here are the routes. Here are the routes where this equipment is coming in from the Soviet Union, and if you'll notice these little X's that are along here, these are the probable positions of Soviet submarines that have up to 20 missiles, nuclear armed, that can reach every city in the United States. You see them along here? These are the probable positions. The Gulf of Mexico, off Cuba, and off the East Coast. Supposedly our Navy knows where they are and they're keeping track of them. At least that's what we've been told. We hope so. But they have been brought in by this area here. They've come in this way. They've come in this way. They've come across here on the north, all the way through behind Greenland and come down, and they've also come across the South Atlantic and up here. Now, you haven't heard about any of that. But recently, within the last 3 weeks, we've received a report that the shipbuilding industry all over the United States is working on a 24-hour basis, and that they are trying to get pipe fitters, welders, and so on as rapidly as possible. Now, we're running out of time, so I just want to come here to a screeching halt and ask you one question. Many Christian people say that it's unchristian to prepare for defense because that means that we don't have any trust in God. I had a lady actually accuse me and saying that God has decreed in the Bible that America will be destroyed, and that if you try to stop it, you're fighting against God. Of course, she couldn't find it in her Bible, and that made her tremendously upset. But I want you to know something, folks, and as strange and as shocking as it is, war is coming to America. It cannot be avoided. There's no way you can get about it. It cannot be stopped politically. And the only way it's going to be stopped is if God Almighty intervenes. Ezekiel 38 and 39 was not written about a little land in Palestine, as we have been taught in our churches. It's an attack that's coming against the United States of America, the NATO countries, and Canada, the Israel nations. And if I had time to preach another hour-and-a-half sermon, I could prove this to you out of the Word of God. One verse of Scripture found in Ezekiel 38 and 10 that has the answer, I believe. It says when the initial attack comes, and it will be an attack in the Middle East, but that'll not be the main target. It says the Soviet, our enemy, which is called Magog, will think an evil thought. Listen to what they will say. I will go up to a land of unwalled villages, to them that are at rest, to take a spoil and a prey of cattle and goods. I want to tell you, my friends, there's no way that you can go up from Moscow and end in Jerusalem. No way at all. What do you do if you go up from Moscow? You go over the polar ice cap and the North Pole and come right smack dab into the heartlands of Canada and the United States. And if they were going to take a prey of cattle, how many cattle do you think they'd get if they went into Israel? You know how many head that they had, according to their own census in 1973? Less than 59,000 head. Well, we got more than that in any county here in this state. We've got more cattle than that. So it couldn't hardly be that country that they were going for. But listen to me, my friends. The Bible tells us, the Apostle Paul tells us, that we need to be prepared, and that if you don't prepare, and you find this in 1 Timothy 5 and 8, that a Christian who will not provide for his own, especially for his household, is worse than an infidel. And I want to tell you, my friends, that that's not just talking about food and clothing and shelter. That's talking about protection for our people, too. You know, Noah didn't build that huge ship back there many, many years ago and work 120 years on it and equip it so that his family could go on a sailing vacation. He built it because God Almighty warned him to, and he did it under God's direction for the salvation of his people. And Joseph down in Egypt didn't store up food for 7 years to sell it to the enemies of Egypt. He stored it up because God Almighty told him to, so that the Israel people could be saved from starvation. And the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 and 6, these are examples for us today. You know, our Christian forefathers in America built forts, and they trained themselves in the use of arms, and they stored food for an emergency. And yet our milquetoast, Alka-Seltzer Christians today say, don't worry about anything like that. God will take care of you. Have faith in God. How foolish, how sad. Yet those same people, they work so that they can get money to buy food and clothing for their families, and they put locks on their doors so that their families will be safe, and they buy fire insurance, and then they turn right around and say, don't prepare for anything like that. God will take care of you. Have faith in God. God's showing us what's coming in this book called the Bible, my friend. He's showing us what's coming. He expects us to do something about it. He's given us the formula for our survival. And it's not a political formula, and it's not a military formula. Some of you aren't going to like this. We aren't going to do it with our own strong right arm and with our many 14s. That's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen when we follow 2 Chronicles 7 and 14. And when our people wake up to the fact that when my people, God said, the ones called by my name, who are they? Well, there's only one group of people that fit there. When my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven. And I'll forgive your sins, and I'll heal your land. And the persecution is coming. Jesus told us about it. Jesus even told us who the people would be that would persecute it. And if we ignore that warning, we're traveling at our own risk. I, for one, am not going to do that. I don't know about you. But I do thank you. I'm sorry I ran over here, but we still had about an hour that we could have covered. Lots more material. If you'd like to talk about it, I'll be happy to. I'm sure Earl will be glad to talk to you about it. I wish we'd had time for some question and answers, but thank you and God bless you. It's been a privilege being with you.
I don't know if any of you thought about it. When he's talking about these Vietnamese buildup, maybe we can get some feedback from some people from other areas. But when he was talking about this thing of cutting off the food supply, it came to my mind that right down here at Garden City, Kansas, there's how many packing plants, Raymond? Do you know?
One great big one.
Well, there's one great big one down there anyhow, and Garden City is being flooded by Vietnamese people down there right now. And that just came to my mind when he mentioned all this. And just think how easy it would be for them to blow up the packing plants if they've got those people in all these areas where all these packing plants are. That just came to my mind when he was, and at the same time, all of this is going on. What are the scribes doing? What are the enemy scribes doing? They're warning America to, don't you listen to those Christian patriot, kingdom identity, Bible preaching people. They're going to ruin America. And here we got thousands of enemies all around us, and they're trying to tell our people to be afraid of us. Isn't that right? They're smearing Christian Israel patriots. So another thing that came to my mind is just like Jack said, when this, I feel possibly this buildup in the South is just a decoy, because the Bible says they're going to come out of the North. So that's something that came to my mind that I just wanted to throw out at you. We got. Okay. Right.
What shift are they taking? The night shift. The night shift. Now get the cogs rolling a little bit, people, and think of that.
Larry, much of that information I covered this morning will be available in a pamphlet form. I rather suspect that it's my home now. I was waiting for it for the printers when I came here. It didn't arrive in time, but it's available in a pamphlet form. There'll be 50 cents a piece plus postage if you want a single one, or I think maybe 35 cents in lots of 100 or more, something like that. So if you want to write to me, if you'd like that information in writing, I'll be glad to send it to you.
Okay. All right, we're running a little behind time. That's partly my fault. I cut Jack 5 minutes short on the beginning, so why don't we take about 5 minutes, if that's enough for everybody, and then we'll get back to our program track for him.